Gentleman from Newport News, Mr. Hamilton.
Mr. Speaker, I rise for a point of personal privilege.
Gentleman may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, yesterday we heard a lot of conversation about the Little Red Hen and the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act and Senate budget amendments. And yesterday when we were on the floor, didn't have a copy to look at those Senate budget amendments. But I've gotten a copy and had an opportunity to look through some of them last night and early this morning, and thought it would be instructive to have a little bit of dialogue about what was included in that document. First of all, we have to remember that the legislation passed by Congress, that part of its intent was to provide states with some additional revenue to help them responsibly manage their budgets for fiscal year 2010 and 2011. And as stated, you know, badly needed revenues to helpfully mitigate some of the reductions that the governor had to propose, quite frankly, in his presentation of a budget back in December. Well, Congress provided for Virginia a total of $1.2 billion for state stabilization funds in education, public safety, and just overall revenue stabilization to be spent fiscal year 2010 and 2011. Doing the math, that breaks out to $612 million a year. But when you look at the Educational Stabilization Fund dollars, we find that there's $492 million for education in that package, of which 60% is to be spent on public education, and the remaining percentage to be spent in higher education for 2009. But the Senate budget goes beyond restoring education funding to the fiscal year 2009 level and actually spends more than the $492 million in the entire Educational Stabilization Fund. The Senate spends $640 million from the Education Fund in fiscal year 2010, or about $150 million more than the amounts intended by Congress. In the Flex Fund, which was $108 million for each of the 2 years, the Senate actually spent $176.6 million, or about $69 million more than was intended. And if you look at the Health and Human Resources portion of the budget, a couple of things caught my eye. One, if you remember in the House budget, we provided an additional $1.7 million for autism and developmental disabilities, $1.5 for the Part C early intervention services, and $215,000 for folks to coordinate autism services at the Department of Mental Health, Mental Retardation, and Substance Abuse Services. Mr. Speaker, even with all of the additional revenue that the Senate had for their budget, they actually cut funding for autism services. They reduced by $100,000 the autism program of Virginia, an existing program at Themer-SAS, and they cut $115,000 in one position at the department to coordinate the autism services. The House budget, as you know, had 400 additional MR waivers, 200 to begin July 1st and 200 to begin January 1st. Well, unfortunately, even with all the additional revenue, the budget amendments that we considered last night, they only provide for an additional 200 MR waivers, and that's actually the restoration of the 200 that had previously been cut. And if they hadn't have done that, Mr. Speaker, they wouldn't have been eligible for a lot of the Medicaid funding in that package. Mr. Speaker, also found that there was no restoration of any funding for nursing homes. If you remember, the nursing homes took a pretty large hit in the budget presentation, and we were able to cobble together about $8 million to help restore some of that cut. That was not found, or at least I couldn't find it, in the Senate budget amendment. In public safety, $24 million over the 2-year fiscal year period comes out to $12 million a year. Unfortunately, in looking at this budget, it appears that the Senate, in their budget amendments, spent all $24 million in the first year. won't have anything left for the second fiscal year of that program. And contrary to what was reported, there's some real serious question as to whether they did all of the restorations for sheriffs, clerks, and the sheriffs and the clerks and the Commonwealth attorneys as they profess. So what does it mean? When you look at this package as being a package for 2 years, fiscal year 10 and fiscal year 11, my math indicates that we might be starting fiscal year 11 with a budget deficit or a hole of $456 million. And that's before we start looking at educational rebenchmarking, funding colleges and universities, inmate population cost, Medicaid, employee health insurance, and VRS rate changes. The bottom line, Mr. Speaker, if we had adopted the Senate amendments as suggested to us yesterday, we could have clasped our hands together and jumped off that cliff just like Thelma and Louise. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.